to the CodePrep Podcast. This podcast highlights different ways you can get into tech. Today, our guest is Erica Stanley. We are very lucky to have her here today because she is so amazing. Erica is the engineering manager for a company that was recently voted the #1 place to work in Atlanta, Georgia. She is an international speaker. She has been recognized and rewarded for her contributions to tech, as well as improving diversity and inclusion in tech. She has been featured in articles and publications such as the AJC, Hippopotamus, Inc., HuffPost. Valerie and I met Erica because she is the founder of Women Who Code Atlanta, which I'm proud to say is one of the top 10 Women Who Code chapters worldwide. So thank you, Erica, for joining us here today. So to start off, first question I would like to ask you is, can you tell us about what is your role in tech and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, before I answer your question, I just want to make sure that I get you to write all of my bios going forward. You included all the things, so thank you for that. So my role day to day, I'm an engineering manager at SalesLoft. And so what that means is that I work very closely with engineers to make sure that I'm removing any blockers for them day to day, make sure that we are moving forward as product development team. So I might collaborate with the product team. I might collaborate with product designers to make sure that we're moving items across the board. We use Jira, so that's the terminology I'm thinking of, kind of moving stories across the board. But it also means that I am invested in their career growth as engineers. And so we talk a lot about, what is the next stage for them. A lot of times they're not ready to say, like, this is the thing I want to do, but we kind of move and like we have milestones. And so we kind of move towards those milestones. We have weekly one-on-ones, so we can kind of check in on those. So the milestone check-in could be weekly, or, our one-on-one could be just like, how's your week been going? And we kind of just go into that. Or the milestones could be kind of a quarterly check-in. So it just depends on their path and their growth. But we are always kind of focused on that. And also, what would make your life better as an engineer? That's kind of my job, is to see what we can do to make your life better as an engineer. So that's what I do day to day.
Awesome. So, obviously, as engineering manager, that is several steps down the path. How did you get into engineering in general? And what were your milestones to get to where you are now?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm really old, so there are a lot of milestones.
Yay for the old people.
So originally I got into tech really young. I was a nerd from way back. And I got into tech because I was really interested in video games and graphics. And I wanted to see how things worked. I didn't want to just kind of play the video game. I wanted to make them. And so that's how I got into tech. And so I started really traditionally, actually. I went through a CS program at Clark Atlanta University that ended up being a joint degree bachelor's and master's program. And I did a lot of work, computer graphics work there, worked with the virtual reality research team. And then after graduating from Clark, decided to go to UNC Chapel Hill. They were the #1 school for interactive graphics at the time. And so kind of delved even more deeply into interactive graphics, did a lot of virtual reality, augmented reality type work. Before people understood what that was, I would come home and tell my dad, like, oh, Dad, I'm doing this really cool stuff in virtual reality. You could kind of just see his eyes glaze over, like, what are you even talking about, Erica? So it was just amazing to see, like, in the consumer space. Like, a couple of Christmases ago, I brought home like a Samsung Gear kind of VR headset thing. And to see my dad kind of interacting with it, like, naturally, was just so cool because, first of all, what we had in the early 2000s was not natural at all. But that was just really cool. So that's how I got into tech. After leaving grad school, I worked at a few companies, got into startups pretty early, and then got the startup bug. I worked at a company, Spring Widgets, that was acquired by MySpace back when MySpace was a thing, and could acquire people and companies. And then I worked at another company, Vitru, that was acquired by Oracle. I'm currently at a startup, SalesLoft, that's a little too big to call itself a startup. But when I got there, I was maybe employee 100 and something, maybe 120. And I've been there just a little less than 2 years, and it's already over 300 people at the company. And the engineering team has grown by leaps and bounds as well. When I first got there, I was the only software engineering manager, the only full stack software engineering manager. We have way too many engineers for that to be the case. And so now we have a bunch of engineers. I think our engineering team, product and engineering team, is 70 people currently. And we have 3 full stack software engineering managers. So a lot of growth in a little bit of time. But that's how I kind of got to where I am. Some milestones in my career, kind of the transition from academia to kind of working for like corporate America, and then transitioning into startups was interesting because, again, I was doing a lot of scientific programming, and really kind of we had different goals and like different concerns, obviously, from academia to kind of corporate America. And what was really cool is that once I made that transition into kind of the startup space, a lot of the concerns were the same, because even though they don't call it research and development, a lot of what you do at a very early stage startup is kind of like seeing if this stuff works. You're doing a lot of kind of prototyping. And so it kind of got back to that, oh, I get to work on kind of cutting edge technology type of interest I had. And then just as I progressed in my career, becoming more senior, understanding how to mentor other engineers, and how to mentor engineers that were my peers, but also mentor engineers who were junior to me, was interesting, because it's not the same. You don't mentor people who are maybe more junior in the same way that you would mentor people who are mid-level and senior. So kind of understanding that those changes as you kind of grow in your career. And then I started my own company. So that was interesting, because then you do all the things. So that was definitely a milestone. And that's actually, between owning my own company and working with Women Who Code Atlanta, that's kind of how I got into management. So just understanding so many things that you have to manage with either one of those kind of pushed me in that direction and made me feel like, you know what, I could do this as a career. As someone who owned their own company, I was doing I was wearing several hats. And so I was kind of your lead developer. I was a manager. I was doing a lot of DevOps stuff if I was doing mobile projects, because a lot of times companies don't think through the kind of build process for mobile if they hadn't been doing mobile before. So it was kind of this like, okay, I want to do one job and I want to do one job well instead of doing 3 jobs. Right? So that's kind of like my move into management, was to attempt to bring all of that into one position that I could do really well.
That's interesting to see. You have such a diverse career within tech, that you've done engineering, you've done AR, you've done VR, and now you're into management. So taking advantage of where you are in management, when you interview potential applicants to your company, what do you currently look for? I mean, what types of tidbits of information that you can give to people that are looking to get into tech that they might face when they're in a job interview? Like, is it a hardcore requirement that people have to have a college degree or not? And then, when you start to interview somebody, what do you look at besides, their code?
Mm-hmm. All good questions. I may ask you to repeat some of them, because I'm going to talk and forget them.
Okay.
But so a lot of what we're looking for, we don't necessarily need a college degree. We don't even necessarily need like a boot camp degree or anything like that. We need to see that you are willing to kind of jump into something, learn something new. We need to see kind of evidence of you being excited about this. So we're going to look through your portfolio, but really just for evidence to see, like, this is something that you would work on anyway, right? Like, you might want to show some things outside of your boot camp, or you might want to show things inside your boot camp or your education where you really kind of delved into something that you were passionate about. That's really all we want to see. And we want to see, depending on the level of engineer that we're looking for, we want to see certain things. We want to see understanding of like best practices and standards. If you are newer in your career, we want to see where you really thought through a solution. We want to make sure that your code is testable, even if you don't have tests yet. So that might mean that you are kind of building in smaller modules instead of just like huge files, like huge kind of files that you just dumped a bunch of code in. So we really want to see kind of a thought process through there. And so that's what we're looking for more on the technical side. A lot of what we do, especially at SalesLoft, we really want to make sure that you will adhere with our core values. So you will really make a great core values fit. So we look for that almost before we look for any of that technical stuff, because honestly, a lot of the technical stuff, if you are a very teachable person, we can teach that, right? So we want to make sure that you're going to be someone who wants to grow and learn and share with the team. Someone who is easily teachable, doesn't bring a lot of ego to the equation, and really just kind of wants what's best for our customers and best for our team. And so we look for that almost before we look for some of these technical kind of specifications. And then even in that, it's about how you explain your code, we do have a coding exercise. And so how do you explain that? And then how do you work with engineers to add on top of that is pretty much our process.
Excellent. So it struck me that you said you sort of look at core values first. The phrase culture fit has become such a catchphrase. Mm-hmm. And I feel like sometimes culture fit means, this person actually will get along well in the office, their values are in alignment. But sometimes it almost feels like the phrase culture fit is just sort of, I had a friend who once referred to it as money laundering for bigotry. Like, oh, look, yeah. I'm not discriminating. You're just not a good culture fit. So how, as engineering manager, like how can leaders make sure that when they're saying culture fit, they're actually saying this person is not a good culture fit, and their own sort of, implicit biases that they might not be aware of aren't coming out?
Right. So first of all, I want to piggyback what you're saying, because I think it's a point that a lot of people miss, in that culture fit is not just about, oh, I like to have beer with this person. What if I don't drink beer, right? Like, what if I don't drink? Or what if I don't do some of these things that typical people in tech do, right? Or what if I look very different? I'm a Black woman in tech. I don't look like your typical person in tech. So what happens then? And so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Something that we have done at SalesLoft, and we can always get better at it, but something we've done is just very clearly define our core values, so that these are things, and that's kind of why I switched from saying culture fit to core values. So we really want to make sure you align with our core values. If you don't have those, if that's not something that's clearly defined for you, how do you test someone on that? And I think that's what happens with a lot of companies, is that they don't know what defines their culture. And so when they go in for a culture interview, what are you testing for? You're just testing for if you like that person or if you'd hang out with them, which does not mean that they would be a great person to have on a team. There are a lot of people that I love, but I don't want to work with you, right? Like, I don't want to work with you day to day. So that's not the same thing. Like, just because I like you isn't enough for you to pass a core values interview at SalesLoft. So we have a few core values like glass half full, team over self, bias towards action, things like that we're looking for. And so we have questions that kind of attack those things. We want someone who's not going to wait to solve a problem or wait for someone else to remove a blocker, who will jump in and remove the blocker themselves. Because again, even though we've grown a lot, we are still very much in that startup mentality, and there's so much to do. Like, if you wait for someone to tell you those things, they won't get done when they need to get done. So that's something that we test for. We test for people who can kind of put their goals and let's say, like, there's a really cool technology you want to work with. Well, you might not be able to work with that technology if the team needs to also kind of build on top of whatever this is you're building. So can you put the team's needs over your own needs and your own desires? So those are things that we're looking for. Can you stay positive? When things are moving as quickly as they typically do here at SalesLoft, we need people who can always understand that we're putting the customers first. And that means that there are times where we just have to stay positive. And even though things might be changing really quickly, how do you stay positive with all that change happening? And how do you keep the people around you positive with all of the change? So those are the things that we're looking for in our core values interview. And so, like, we aren't going to say, like, oh, well, this person is, so introverted, I don't know how they would fit in the team. We're not testing for that. We're not testing for your personality. We're testing for, do you align with our core values?
Excellent.
That's great. Looking at the three of us, we're all three women that are in technology. We all have different backgrounds. You know, Valerie's done DevOps, I've done traditional programming. Erica has broken the glass ceiling and has moved into management for a major company here in Atlanta. What advice would you give to women that are looking to get into tech, knowing that even though we're 52% of the population, we're at best 20% of the tech population? So if there's women that are out there that are looking to get into tech, with your experience and your background, what advice and recommendation would you like to share with them?
So first of all, always be practicing, always be working on something that's cool to you. It doesn't have to be, some project that you think will get you your next job. Just work on what's really cool to you, because that means that even as you're trying to get into the industry, you always have something to show for your time and your effort, right? That's just kind of something that is a thing that we all have to understand now, especially if you don't have any tech companies or any work in your background. So keep that portfolio, keep building that portfolio. When you are looking for tech companies, interview them as much as they're interviewing you, because you want it to be a place that you can grow, a place that will support you. Because to me, that's one of the first foundational things you need for inclusion, right? Some place where you can actually be supported to grow as an engineer or a technologist. And so I think a lot of times we are just so happy to get that first job that we don't interview them and people at the company to see if this is a place that you could stay long term. And that's super important, because there's a lot of imposter syndrome that comes with being new to tech or being almost 20 years in tech. There's a lot of imposter syndrome because we don't see a lot of people who look like us. So you really want some place that's not going to make that worse, right? You really want some place that will, when you're doubting yourself, will say, no, you're amazing, keep working, right? And that's what we need to not just get into tech, but to stay in tech. And that's been a focus of what we've done with Women Who Code for a very long time, is to not just help people get here, but help people stay here and help people build their careers and thrive in tech. So those are two things that I would look for. Inside that interviewing the company, I would also say, like, really interview your manager very, very closely. Like, having a supportive manager has been all the difference in the world between, what I was doing before and my move to SalesLoft. I have a very supportive manager, very supportive management and leadership team, and that sets the stage for a lot of these things to happen. So.
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice. So we're getting down to the last couple questions. As someone who's in my first role and did not have terribly many interviews before I got my job that I love so much, what are some interesting sort of technical interview questions you've either had to go through as an applicant or that you've issued now that you're on the other side of that? What are some just sort of outliers, some interesting questions, maybe one or two that, those of us terrified of that dreaded technical interview can sort of go research?
I would say, so I've been through a lot of technical interviews, whether it's whiteboarding or just kind of coding, where you don't touch the code that you did for, say, your coding exercise. And so as having people ask you, like, why you made certain design decisions can be daunting, because it's like, oh, I was just trying to finish this, right? Like I wasn't really putting a whole lot of super detailed thought into this, because I knew I didn't have a whole lot of time given my day job and like finishing up this coding exercise. So being thoughtful about what you're handing in, even if it means that you hand in less, right? Like, even if it means that you don't finish the exercise, but what you have there is really thoughtful. It's been interesting, like seeing that transition of people actually asking what my reasons for doing this way. And some really cool things come out of that, or asking you to build on top of that, because that, even if they don't ask you to explain your design decisions, you will have to delve into your design decisions as you have to refactor this. So just really understanding what you have sent in really well, that you could explain it to someone. And in that explaining to someone, by the way, a lot of people will stumble over like jargon, right? stumble over the right terminology for something, if you understood why you were doing it and you can explain in kind of layman's terms why you can do that, sometimes that's better in a lot of cases than understanding the jargon. And if jargon comes up, most reasonable companies will say you understand at a very low level what you were doing. So this just having a name for it is not as necessary as you understood what was actually happening in your code. But that's been interesting to see that transition over time where people actually care. What were your design decisions?
That's awesome. That's great advice that we can share with our listeners, because we want to encourage people to get into tech, but then we also want to, help them in that interview process once they decide to get into tech to get their first or their next job. So last question that we'd like to ask you is, what is one thing that you would like to recommend to our listeners? And it can be anything from a training course to a book to your favorite pressure cooker, anything that you think would benefit people that are interested in tech.
So boiling it down to one thing is tough, but there's a book by Camille Fournier that gets recommended so much, but I think a lot of people, I think it's called The Manager's Path, and so many people think it's for managers. Actually, it's for engineers and technologists at any stage of their career through to management. And so what's really cool about it is that it shows you at different levels of your career what you can kind of expect from your manager. And so, and it also lets you know, like, what does that ladder look like, right? So that would be probably my top recommendation.
Wonderful.
Well,
We'll be sure to include a link to that for our listeners somewhere in the notes.
She's amazing. She also has a blog where she talks a lot about some of this stuff. So I highly recommend her blog as well.
Perfect. We'll include links to that in the show notes, as Valerie said. But Erica, thank you so very much for being a guest on our podcast today.
Anytime.